Behind every crown, sword, or throne, there's usually a brain that wasn't working quite right. Some of history's biggest names were brilliant, powerful, and also completely unstable. From revolutionary leaders to saints and inventors, some of the minds that shaped history were also on the edge of losing theirs. I'm Mike with List 25, and these are 25 historical figures who were secretly insane. But before we get rolling, don't forget to like and subscribe because it lets the algorithm know that you're one of the smart ones. Okay, let's dig into the madness. 25. Nikola Tesla. Tesla wasn't just ahead of his time, he was somewhere completely different. The man who lit up cities and dreamed of wireless power also lived inside a mind that never stopped spinning. Tesla had all the classic symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. He couldn't eat without stacking exactly 18 napkins, refused to touch anyone's hair, and wouldn't stay in a hotel room unless the number was divisible by 3. He even walked around buildings 3 times before going inside. He also suffered from insomnia so bad that he only managed to sleep 2 hours a night, and his long bouts of isolation probably made things worse. Tesla often described seeing flashes of light before his inventions appeared in his mind, which some psychologists believe could have been hallucinations linked to exhaustion or sensory hypersensitivity. Modern researchers like Dr. Michael J.S. Finn from the University of Leeds actually thinks his compulsions, paranoia, and near-delusional focus put him somewhere on the spectrum between obsessive genius and full psychosis. 24. Henry VIII. England's King Henry VIII began as a confident, athletic young monarch who loved attention almost as much as he loved power. But even early on, he needed constant praise, couldn't stand being challenged, and expected the world to bend to his will. In fact, psychologists like Dr. C. Alan B. Duras from the University of Nottingham and several psychiatric researchers describe Henry as displaying narcissistic and antisocial traits, things like grandiosity, lack of empathy, and manipulativeness. But something changed after 1536. Henry was thrown from his horse during a jousting match and knocked unconscious for 2 hours. It wasn't his first head injury, but it was the one that broke him. After that, the charm was gone. Henry became paranoid, explosive, and cruel, ordering the deaths of more than 50,000 people, including 2 of his wives. Historians say the injury didn't create a tyrant, it only unleashed him. 23. Adolf Hitler. Apart from, the very obvious, Nazi Germany's leader displayed chronic paranoia and delusions. By the time physician Ernst Günther Schenk saw him in 1945, Hitler was barely human. His hands trembled, his back was hunched, and his eyes were vacant. Schenk later described him as, quote, a living corpse. Hitler's physical and mental collapse was staggering. Years of poor health, untreated digestive illness, and constant stress had already wrecked his body. Then came his dependence on his personal doctor, Theodor Morel, who filled him with injections and pills for every complaint. Records show Hitler was taking as many as 90 different substances, including morphine, derivatives, tranquilizers, and amphetamines. Those drugs, combined with severe insomnia, anxiety, and what doctors suspect was Parkinson's disease, drove his behavior into full-blown instability. By his final days, Hitler was hallucinating, obsessing over betrayal, and ordering impossible military defenses. His final decisions came from a mind chemically and psychologically broken beyond repair. 22. Joan of Arc. At 13, Joan of Arc lived through a traumatic attack on her village that claimed her sister's life. Soon after, she began hearing voices and seeing visions of saints like Saint Michael, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret. Today, many believe that trauma may have triggered schizophrenia or another neuropsychiatric disorder, since her vivid voices and visions align with the symptoms seen in such conditions. Some neurologists, however, have proposed that her experiences fit a rare form of epilepsy called idiopathic partial epilepsy, with auditory features. They base this on trial records describing sudden sounds and lights, episodes during sleep, and reactions to external triggers like church bells rather than constant delusion. Whatever it was, her experiences were powerful enough to convince grown men to follow her into war. At 17, she led armies. At 19, she was burned at the stake for heresy. 21. Saddam Hussein. By most accounts, Saddam Hussein wasn't just ruthless, he was psychologically unhinged. Psychiatric studies describe him as a textbook case of malignant narcissism, a mix of antisocial behavior, paranoia, and extreme sadism. Dr. Gerald Post, who profiled Hussein for the CIA, called him, quote, the most dangerous kind of personality disorder. He saw enemies everywhere and trusted almost no one, not even family. A 2007 study published in Military Psychology found he scored alarmingly high for narcissistic, paranoid, sadistic, and antisocial traits, the kind of profile shared by some of history's most violent dictators. His cruelty was legendary. He ordered the gassing of Kurdish civilians, had political rivals executed on camera, and used torture as a public warning. Even his closest allies lived in constant fear. Power wasn't enough for Saddam. He needed to dominate completely and turn terror itself into a tool of control. 20. Napoleon Bonaparte. I am the instrument of destiny. Napoleon wrote that in Correspondance de Napoléon l'Air, and he meant it. His entire life was built on that belief, that every decision, victory, and conquest was proof he'd been chosen for greatness. But underneath the glory was a man whose mind swung wildly between brilliance and volatility. Historical accounts describe hypersensitivity to criticism, explosive temper, and an obsessive need for control. Modern researchers say those traits line up with a mix of narcissistic and bipolar behavior, bursts of manic energy, sleepless ambition, and crushing fatigue that followed. Medical students have also found signs of stress-induced seizures, which could point to neurological instability. It's now 2 centuries later, and psychiatry still uses his name to describe delusions of grandeur. 19. Joseph Stalin. You didn't question Stalin twice. Most people didn't even risk it once. Medical historians describe him as a classic psychopath, narcissistic, sadistic, and distrustful of everyone. Childhood abuse, physical deformities, and years in exile carved him into a man who saw betrayal in every shadow. The South African Medical Journal later described his mind as profoundly disturbed, completely stripped of empathy, and warped by cruelty. Even those closest to him weren't safe. He executed his generals, purged his party, and mocked his son's near-fatal attempt on his own life by saying he cannot even shoot straight. 18. Queen Maria I of Portugal. After losing her husband, 2 children, and even her confessor in quick succession, Queen Maria I of Portugal started slipping into a severe mental decline. Accounts from the late 1780s describe nights filled with her desperate wailing, waves of religious guilt, and an obsession with sin that crossed into delusion. By 1792, her doctors ruled her unfit to govern. Her son stepped in as regent, while Dr. Francis Willis, the same physician who once treated King George III, was brought in to assess her. He eventually admitted there was nothing medicine could do. Modern psychiatrists think Maria's breakdown fits the profile of bipolar disorder with psychotic features, likely set off by trauma and strengthened by family history. The Braganza dynasty had long struggled with mental instability, and Maria ended up bearing the worst of it. 17. Bobby Fischer. The chess prodigy Bobby Fischer was a genius who could see 15 moves ahead when it came to chessboards, but couldn't escape the ones in his own head. His teachers called him antisocial, even as a child, and his mother took him to psychiatrists who also played chess, hoping that they would somehow better understand him. Sadly, they didn't. By his 30s, Fischer's mind had begun to alternate between logic and delusion. He refused to play unless lighting, chairs, and cameras met his exact demands. He claimed his food was poisoned, his phone was tapped, and his opponents were part of an international plot. One well-known psychiatric review describes this as a textbook case of delusional disorder, internally consistent but detached from reality. His thinking stayed sharp inside the 64 squares of a chessboard, but everywhere else, his logic turned hostile. 16. Charles Manson. Charles Manson spent over 40 years behind bars in California, and during that period, psychologists threw almost every label imaginable at him. His files mention paranoid schizophrenia, chronic psychosis, schizoaffective disorder, delusional disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, and several personality disorders, including schizotypal and paranoid. One report even called it a, quote, thought disorder with grandiose ideation. Some doctors said he was dangerously insane. Others argued he was just manipulative and cruel. By the late 90s, prison psychiatrists had settled on schizophrenia as his primary diagnosis. They gave him antipsychotics like Seroquel, but he rarely took them. He stayed defiant to the end. In recent years, however, new reviews of his psychological files have suggested that Manson wasn't disconnected from reality at all. He was cold, deliberate, and aware of the damage he caused. So, more calculating psychopath than genuine psychotic. 15. Howard Hughes. The richest man in America was a movie mogul, record-setting pilot, and mechanical genius who tried to control everything around him. That control became his sickness. He developed crippling OCD, convinced that germs and dust could kill him. He scrubbed his hands raw, wrapped doorknobs in tissues, and refused to touch anyone. When he couldn't stop the rituals, he locked himself inside hotel suites for months at a time, giving orders by note so no one had to come near. Years of plane crashes left him with head injuries, pain, and an addiction to codeine that only deepened his paranoia. He stopped cutting his hair and nails, stopped trusting people, and vanished completely from public life. By the time doctors classified his state as end-stage obsessive-compulsive neurosis, he was living proof that brilliance and madness can share the same cockpit. 14. Muammar Gaddafi. The infamous dictator spent 42 years in power, convincing himself he was both a revolutionary hero and a divine prophet. Before his execution in 2011, he held public meetings in Bedouin tents lined with velvet, surrounded by an all-female security unit, and gave speeches that swung from political rants to strange cosmic sermons. The CIA once said he was on the verge of madness, while psychologists who studied his records later described him as dangerously narcissistic, manipulative, and deeply paranoid. A 2024 personality profile went so far as to call him a predator driven by delusions of grandeur and suspicion. He trusted no one, not even family, and believed his rule was destiny. In the end, it was that same fantasy that got him killed. 13. Vincent van Gogh. Between hallucinations, depressive collapses, and bursts of frantic inspiration, he lived every symptom of what doctors today would call a severe bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Some neurologists think he also had temporal lobe epilepsy, worsened by heavy absinthe and near starvation. When he wasn't painting, he was in hospitals or asylums, terrified of his own thoughts and desperate to stay productive. During one episode in Arles, he sliced off part of his ear and gave it to a woman at a brothel, then returned to painting days later as if nothing had happened. In the end, he couldn't carry the weight any longer, and his illness took him at just 37. 12. Edgar Allan Poe. Poe lived like one of his own Gothic stories. His mind swung between bursts of genius and deep collapse. Historical records and new analyses point toward a mix of bipolar disorder and alcoholism worsened by grief and poverty. He came from a family already marked by addiction, and by his mid-20s, he was drinking heavily and writing feverishly. Periods of depression were followed by days of near-manic energy when he would work non-stop. Toward the end of his life, witnesses described hallucinations, confusion, and violent delirium. Some medical historians even suggest neurological problems or brain inflammation may have pushed him further into psychosis. 11. Gilles de Rais. For a man who once rode out into battle alongside Joan of Arc, Gilles de Rais is now considered the first sadistic serial offender, the early model of the serial killer archetype with the same victim type, the same ritual, and the same order. Psychologists later defined it as organized pathological sadism. Gilles de Rais turned his castles into hunting grounds. Children disappeared by the dozens, hidden by his titles, wealth, and charm. He drained his fortune on alchemy, black rituals, and half-mad attempts to summon spirits that could restore his power. When his crimes finally surfaced, even hardened soldiers recoiled. He wasn't a monster of impulse, but one of method, who planned every act and repeated until it became routine. 10. Virginia Woolf. The brilliant writer experienced years of abuse from her half-brothers, a trauma compounded by a family history of mental illness. Her first major breakdown came at 13, after her mother's death, when she said she could hear her mother's voice speaking to her. Those hallucinations returned throughout her life, joined by deep depression, and her mood swung violently between creative frenzy and despair. Researchers now identify her pattern as bipolar disorder with psychotic features, a condition that worsened over time. In her final letters, she wrote, "I begin to hear voices, and I can't concentrate." Days later, in 1941, she filled her coat pockets with stones and walked into the River Ouse. 9. Elizabeth Bathory. The Blood Countess fits about every modern marker for psychopathy: charm, manipulation, sadism, and a total lack of conscience. Psychologists believe she had antisocial personality disorder with strong psychopathic traits, fueled by epilepsy and a violent family history. Her seizures, in all likelihood, damaged the parts of her brain that regulate empathy and impulse, while her noble upbringing normalized doing, well, whatever she wanted to do. Her pathology and noble power made her untouchable for years, so much so that nobody will ever know exactly how many young women and girls she murdered. 8. Vladimir Lenin. By the end of his life, Vladimir Lenin was barely recognizable as the man who had once reshaped Russia. In his final years, he suffered multiple strokes that robbed him of speech and movement, leaving him trapped inside a failing body and mind. Autopsy reports later revealed his arteries were hardened and his brain riddled with lesions. Some researchers have even claimed that neurosyphilis played a part. Either way, the effects were unmistakable: paranoia, rage, and an obsessive need for control that consumed everyone around him. He is now believed to have been a functional psychopath, a man whose charm and intellect masked domination, manipulation, and a total absence of empathy. 7. Ivan the Terrible. From the moment his father died and his mother was poisoned, Ivan the Terrible's life turned into a lesson in paranoia. He grew up watching noble families fight over control of his throne, sometimes while he and his brother went hungry. That early cruelty burned into him. As a boy, he took it out on animals. As a man, he did the same to people. He was the perfect storm of trauma, illness, and unchecked power. Combined with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological condition that can cause mood swings, hallucinations, and explosive rages, it explains his sudden bursts of guilt followed by massacres that wiped out entire cities. Eyewitnesses said he prayed between killings, wept after confessions, and then ordered more deaths the next morning. That's a perfect mix of psychopathy and paranoid delusion. A man driven by divine guilt and godlike fury at the same time. 6. Edvard Munch. Van Gogh wasn't the only artist to go mad. Have you ever seen this painting? Yep. The artist, Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, turned his own breakdown into one of the world's most famous images. Munch lived with what doctors today believe was bipolar disorder. His diaries describe long spells of crushing depression, followed by bursts of manic energy where he couldn't stop working. He also experienced hallucinations, both visual and auditory. According to Munch himself, the scream came from one of them. He wrote about walking with friends one evening when, quote, the sky turned blood red, and he heard the scream of nature around him. Viewed through today's psychological lens, he likely had a psychotic disorder alongside bipolar symptoms, and his art was a way of holding himself together when his mind tried to come apart. 5. King Christian VII of Denmark. Christian VII wasn't exactly what you'd call a stable ruler. He once leapt over his own courtiers just to see their faces, threw food at dinner guests, and slapped minstrels mid-conversation for no reason anyone could explain. At one banquet, he even demanded the ceiling be decorated with live birds that chirped in Greek. His behavior swung wildly between confusion, paranoia, and self-destruction. His doctor, Johann Friedrich Struensee, kept detailed notes describing him as insane throughout his long reign, and modern researchers later confirmed just how accurate that was. For years, Struensee ran the country through royal decrees while the king drifted between moods and fixations. Later, new factions pushed him aside almost entirely. Even his own court called him weak-minded, which in the 18th century was about as close as they came to saying he was insane. And yet somehow, he remained on the throne until the very end. 4. Donatien Alphonse François, the Marquis de Sade. It's hard to know what's stranger, that the word sadism comes from the cruelty of this man, or that France now keeps his most infamous manuscript as a national treasure. The Marquis de Sade was a best-selling author who spent more than 30 years locked up for crimes that made even 18th century France cringe. He was accused of torturing servants, poisoning prostitutes with aphrodisiacs, and holding children captive in his chateau. But he somehow managed to avoid execution. During his time behind bars, he wrote his most obscene and philosophical works, including the 120 Days of Sodom, the 12-meter-long scroll that now sits in the French National Archives. Depending on how you look at the things he did, he was either a depraved lunatic or a philosopher. But most psychologists will tell you he was a sadist, if nothing else. 3. Sultan Ibrahim the Mad. Sultan Ibrahim I spent his early life locked inside the Ottoman palaces, trapped in the kafes, a gilded cage for princes waiting, often in terror, to see who would survive long enough to rule. By the time his turn came in 1640, the years of isolation had already broken something in him. His chronicles speak of wild mood swings, sudden fits of violence, and a harem so large that even his advisors couldn't keep track of all of them. He drained the treasury on luxuries, drowned over 200 of his concubines after a rumor of betrayal, and trusted no one. In 1648, the same officials who'd bowed before him dragged him from the throne and strangled him with a bowstring. 2. Mary Todd Lincoln. Mary Todd Lincoln buried 3 sons, watched her husband get shot beside her, and somehow had to keep living after that. Her behavior became erratic. She would go on frantic shopping sprees and was convinced that someone was trying to poison her. She claimed thieves were breaking in to steal her fortune and spoke to people no one else could see. Her only surviving son, Robert, finally stepped in. In 1875, he convinced a Chicago jury to declare her insane, and she was sent to Bellevue Place Sanitarium. 4 months later, her sister secured her release, but Mary was never the same. She wrote about spirits and unseen visitors until her death. Today, historians believe she truly suffered from bipolar disorder with psychosis, which was made worse by trauma. 1. Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche's unraveling began long before that famous day in Turin. In the months leading up to 1889, he was already slipping, laughing uncontrollably, staying shut in his room for days, and playing piano naked while mumbling about gods and destiny. Then came the day he saw the horse being whipped. He ran to embrace it and collapsed. When he woke up, the old Nietzsche was gone. Friends said he spoke clearly about others, but couldn't recognize himself. His letters became delusional, signed Dionysus or the Crucified, and his thoughts turned into a mess. He spent the next 11 years silent and paralyzed, living under care until his death in 1900. Doctors initially blamed neurosyphilis, but newer studies show that tumors, degenerative brain disease, or even exhaustion from the intensity of his own philosophy might have been to blame. Nietzsche went looking for the abyss, and it answered back. And that's all I have for you today. But if you haven't had enough, our related video, 25 Historic Mysteries Scientists Are Still Unraveling, might be the best one yet. Think of it as history's biggest game of connect the dots, where, half the dots are still missing. You'll love it. The link to that one is going to show up about right here any second now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you again next time.